did.
Okay. Great. Okay, so we are now live on YouTube. Welcome to the Wikigender first ever webinar on Engendering the City, Gender and Urban Governance. This is the final day for the online discussion, and we're bringing together Catherine Travers from Women in Cities International, and then hopefully we'll be joined by Hilary Murphy from UN Habitat. To sort of wrap up on this online discussion, give any last comments, and then also if there are any questions that come in. So just to give some brief background on Wikigender, since for those of you who weren't able to participate in the discussions, you know, it was launched in 2008. It's an online platform for gender advocates, researchers, and also anyone who's sort of interested in ideas around gender equality and development. And it was relaunched recently with a more user-friendly platform. And then this most recent online discussion on gender and urban governments is actually the third part of a three-part series that the OECD Development Center has been putting on with Women in Cities International and UN Habitat. So the first one was on gender and urbanization in Africa, second, gender and urban mobility. And this was in collaboration on Twitter. We are also taking and retweeting everything that happened on Twitter. So just a little background on the topic that we're talking about today. When we talk about gender and inclusive urban governance, there's actually two parts to it. So one is sort of the substantive representation of women in urban decision making. So making sure that women's voices are heard at the table where decisions are made in local and urban governments. The other one is enhanced awareness around what the gender-specific needs are when we're making decisions in the government level. What we see, although there is a lack of data on this, and this is something we're going to talk about, what we see is that often urban governance is gender blind, so it's not taking into account the needs of women and girls, and it's also women are underrepresented in urban government structures. So, for example, in 2013, women made up only 5% of capital city mayors, and only 6% of mayors in cities with over 1 million inhabitants. So now we're going to open it up to Catherine. We're going to look at the different questions that we talked about during the discussion, and we're hoping that Hilary will be able to join us. If you're following, you can follow along at Wikigender on Twitter. With the hashtag Making Cities Inclusive, where you can post any questions you have, any final comments, and we'll try to incorporate them into the webinar while we go. So now we're going to go over and so we're going to start. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I guess I should have introduced myself. I'm Annalise Thim. I work with the OECD Development Center and Wikigender, and have been, behind the scenes of this online discussion with a colleague of mine. So now moving on to the different questions. Hi, Catherine. Do you want to sort of introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, Annalise. I'm Catherine Travers. I'm the director of Women in Cities International. We're based in Montreal and working on issues of women's safety and participation in governance, not only in Montreal, but in cities around the world.
Great. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the first question. So the first question was on how can we ensure that women's specific needs are correctly assessed and taken into account by leaders and the different stakeholders at the city level. So I don't know if you want to speak on this.
Sure. I think what I'll actually do is I want to break down this question a little bit further. So when we talk about women's specific needs, I think it's really important to remember that not all women are the same. And so, yes, we can talk about things like gender gaps, which are some obvious overlooking of how women use the city and what women's needs are in a city. But each of those needs is really different depending on your background, depending on your socioeconomic status, on what it is that you do in the city. And so I think it's really important that as we talk about inclusive governance and we talk about gender inclusion, that we're really taking that kind of intersectional lens to make sure that we're considering the needs of all women and not just some women. So I think the first thing, and you alluded to it in the introduction, is that there's a real lack of data around this. And so we are seeing more and more research that's coming out, and particularly at a local level from local women's organizations that are trying to understand these gender gaps. And so what is it that women need from the city, and how are cities not responding to women's needs? And I think in the context of the Habitat 3 process, and we've been talking about what does a new urban agenda look like for the next 20 years, it's really shed light on some of that and has really incited a lot of people to reflect on how can we have a new urban agenda that makes sure that women are included in it, right, as as active participants. And so certainly there's a lot of people are calling for space for participation, right? So and I think that that's two ways, and perhaps we'll get to that. So participation not just as elected officials, but also just participation as residents of a city with a legitimate voice to speak out on the issues that affect them. And so there's different kinds of participation that we're looking at. And then certainly there's also some capacity needed to even make people aware of these processes. In the discussions, someone, and perhaps it was Hillary, mentioned about how a lot of the conversation around governance in particular is rather normative, right? And so that, that's kind of high level theoretical, and it doesn't necessarily feel very practical. And so perhaps we need to break that down in ways that make it feel more accessible. So yes, there needs to be gender transformative change at a structural level, but more practically, how are there some easy solutions that we can find to bring women together with elected officials to speak out on the issues that are affecting them, but also to work together to make change. And so I think that we have to look at things in kind of a phased way.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. One thing that came up often in the online discussion was this idea of trust, and that there's a lack of trust at the local level, a lack of trust between women and the government officials, and that often women don't, have enough trust in the official structures to work through them. So they end up sort of creating their own communities, working alongside, but unfortunately not together, with the government structures. And that part of this is a lack of knowledge, also trust. And then one way to maybe overcome this was this capacity building, gender sensitivity training for urban leaders or those who are in the government on what it takes to work with women's groups, possibly. There definitely can be a key actor involved in this, and also why this is necessary.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that we've often seen, and again, in speaking in this context of the new urban agenda, and kind of a push for the recognition of women and grassroots women, so women working at the real local level, their contributions to it. What we say is they're already doing it. They're already organizing at the local level. They're already making change in their community, and they're just kind of going forward in spite of all of these normative processes, right? And so it's important to recognize that. But I think that you're right, it did come up in the discussions. I think that there's a need to in terms of capacity building, we often think about capacity building of local groups to participate in governance. But we don't talk about the need to build the capacity of those who already hold the power to be able to participate and partner effectively with local women's groups, right? And I think that you're totally right that it does go both ways. And so with Plan International and UN Habitat, we have a partnership to do a Safe Cities for Girls program. And a big part of that program is on governance, in fact, because we want adolescent girls to speak out about the issues that are affecting them and to negotiate with government stakeholders for change. And so we've developed capacity building curriculums for those different levels. So for girls to understand city processes, to practice speaking out, to participate in generating data that they can speak to, and also in brainstorming solutions that they feel would work in their community for girls like them, right? At the same time, we have curriculum for municipal stakeholders to understand things like gender social norms and how those can be detrimental, to understand about how policies are not taking into consideration girls' needs, to understand the importance of doing so, so that by the time that we bring them both to the table together in what we call interface meetings, they're both ready to speak to each other, but also to listen to each other.
No, I think that's really interesting. That somewhat leads into our next question on how can we ensure that women and men have equal representation and at all the different stages. So from the urban planning to the implementation, starting with the decision making down to the actual, getting out there, and whether that's the construction sites or transportation, all of that.
So one of the things we talked a lot about has been gender transformative change, right? Which means we're talking about widespread systemic change in terms of gender relations at all levels. And I think that your question really embodies that, right? Because I mean, this starts even from the school age, right? So if a boy's education is prioritized and privileged, and the boy goes to school and then goes on to higher education and then goes into politics, while the girl is more responsible for her household, then you're already seeing kind of a two-track system being put into place from a very young age that does have a direct implication on representation in governance, in official governance. And so I think that needs to be done, again, systemically, but across all levels. And people have put into place quota systems. Sometimes they work. Sometimes you have a government like our government in Canada who comes in, and the first thing that he did was make sure that there was an equal number of men and women as ministers, and then very famously said when he was asked about it, he said, because it's 2016, right? And that was it, no additional explanation needed. And then there's other interesting initiatives that have come out, and someone had mentioned it in the discussion as well. In Turkey, for example, they have put into place a very interesting system where there's a woman mayor and a man mayor in 102 cities across Turkey. And so that's it's a different kind of initiative. I don't personally know a lot about it, but I find it super intriguing and a different way of approaching governance that could, in fact, have very interesting effects at the ground level.
No, it's really interesting. When I saw that someone shared that, I went and looked it up and wasn't able to find too much right away, but it's a very interesting idea. I guess my fear, and I think this because I work on gender, that kind of popped up was, oh, but are they going to be given different portfolios?
Right.
Have to make sure that doesn't, that, they're given the same equal weight and that their decision making is still taken equally. But it's a very interesting idea. Another thing that came up was the idea of, we already talked about capacity building for those who are in the government already, but then also capacity building for women. So women politicians, women who want to be a part of the government. I think all of those can also be really important. And then also, you mentioned Canada and the great strides that they are making. They also start a 3-year funding stream to sort of identify the systemic barriers to women's participation in local government. So that'll be really interesting to see what comes out of that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So then if we want the next question, getting it. And this, I think, is a great question because we are going into Habitat 3, and there has been a lot of gender talk around it. I mean, obviously there can always be more, but how can we better raise awareness on gender equality and sort of work at shifting these social norms at the city level? So any sort of campaigns, different activities that have really brought this subject to the forefront?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I think that just shedding light on the issue is itself a really important thing, because then it raises awareness that perhaps this is something that needs to be addressed further. I think things like that statement that I mentioned earlier that our prime minister said about because it's 2016, nothing additional, that went with it. Things like that. I think like what Turkey's doing, that now we're talking about, I think that those are the kinds of things that break the mold a little bit and that seem intriguing to us because there are things that we haven't seen before, or that also seem so obvious that how have we not seen these things before, that those generate conversation. I haven't seen as much around awareness raising about these kinds of issues, but there are local level initiatives. So in Montreal, for example, we have next year, 2017, locally is an election year for us. And so already this year, we have a council. It's called Conseil des Montréalaises. It's a council of women from Montreal. And so you can apply to be on the council. You don't necessarily need to be an elected official to participate. But they did, and I think it's the second year that they've done it, is kind of a simulation of how the municipal government runs. And it's held in the municipal, in the town hall over a weekend, so over a 2-day period, in the actual rooms where they negotiate, where the councillors sit and where the mayor sits. And the idea of having that kind of a simulation over the 2-day period was to prepare these women for running for office so that they had a sense of what to expect when they got there. Right. And so it was really to encourage political participation. And they did kind of an outreach where you had to apply for it. And it was there was a selection according to diversity too. So really bringing in that intersectional lens that we talked about before. And I think things like that are what trigger discussions.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I know in France, they've also, so not with women in governance, in urban governance, excuse me, but they've launched a few sort of anti-sexual harassment campaigns in urban spaces, which have also been, as I'm based in Paris, those have been very interesting to see. I wanted to go back to sort of the idea of women's and men's equal political representation in urban governance structures and bring up something that was said in our very first online discussion that has stayed with me. So in the first online discussion, we were looking at the gender dynamics of Africa's urbanization. And so because it's sort of happening very fast, they are dealing with these issues kind of in hyper speed, and yet they're dealing with many of the issues that all cities are faced with. And one of these is equal representation of women and men and inclusive urban governance. And something that someone said was, it doesn't actually matter if there is, it obviously would be great to have an equal number, but it shouldn't be left to the women, whether in government or not, to deal with women's issues, and that all political representatives need to be held accountable. So I don't know if you want to talk some about sort of political accountability and how do we hold these leaders who are supposed to represent the entire city, which is, women and men. I don't know if you have any examples of holding them accountable, any cities that have looked into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of parts of your question. And so I agree with you. I don't feel that having 50-50, I think that that's symbolic, and I think that that can raise good awareness and probably should be something that we're striving to achieve. But I don't think that's what solves the problem, right? I don't think even if you're a woman who's elected to government, that it necessarily means that you're a woman who's fighting for women's rights. And so I think that's something that's important for us to keep in mind. And someone in this discussion, and I thought it was fabulous actually, they said that what we need isn't necessarily more women in there, but we need more feminists in there. And I think that that was hitting the nail on the head, as they say, because there are elected officials who are there, regardless of if they're men or if they're women, absolutely need to be able to understand why it's essential that we have cities that respond to women's needs and how that benefits not just women, but everyone, right? And without that kind of connection of an elected official with the constituency group, right? And women are half of the constituency group, then it's a huge governance gap as well, right? And so you can't run a city effectively when you're not considering the needs of the people who are there, right? And so that's also a transformative shift that I think we need to see. Now, in terms of the second part of your question, which was around, oops, I just blanked. What was the second part of your question that I was coming to?
Holding leaders accountable.
Holding leaders accountable. Yeah, exactly right. So on holding leaders accountable, yeah, I also feel that that's an important governance piece. And for me, governance isn't just about being elected to government, but it's about having a say in the governance of a city, right? And so I think that participatory evaluations and ways that men and women in cities can participate in saying what they like about their city, what they don't like about their city, what's working or not working. I think those are ways that we can hold governments accountable in a much broader, more participatory way. I feel like technology can play a really interesting and important role for this. I don't know that we've seen it so much, but there are applications like Safety Pin, for example, which is developed in India, and it's basically a digital version of the women's safety audits. I think those can have the potential to be really interesting tools that can be used in governance, because if you have thousands of people auditing the city and saying what works for them or doesn't work for them and sharing ideas of what change they want to see, and then governments can respond to those things, then I think that becomes a really interesting way of broadening the base of people who have a say in what's going on in their cities. Another way that's used quite a bit, and I think and is currently being digitized, is community scorecards. And we didn't use community scorecards specifically, but the same methodology had applied to a water and sanitation project that we did, which was looking at safety issues specifically in two peri-urban resettlements of Delhi, and there's questions around literacy in the community, and what we did was an evaluation where the women put rocks along. It's a spider evaluation, right? So the further away, the better they are. The closer they are, the better they are. The further away, the worse the quality of the services are. And they were rating essential services. Now, they did this for 24-month projects. They did it over 24 months. And the services did get better because the service providers knew that the women were doing this every month. They were getting together in the community and they were saying, okay, how's our access to the drains this month? How's our access to water? What's the quality of the services? And then that actually had an impact on service change. And so I think, again, giving more room for people from communities to be able to participate in saying what's working for them or not working for them is really essential to being a part of that transformative change.
Hi, great. Thank you so much for all of that. We are very happy to have Hillary Murphy with us. Hi, Hillary, are you there?
Finally.
Hi, great.
Sorry, I had some serious technical problems.
No worries. We are just sort of making our way through some of the questions. We already looked at the first questions, and what we've been just looking at now is two parts to the question. One, how do we ensure equal representation of women and men? But then also, how do we ensure accountability of urban government? So I don't know if you want to speak or if you want us to keep going.
No, actually, go ahead. I'll jump in once I catch up. Give me a minute or two.
Great, sure. So Catherine was just sort of going on to different ways of how do we hold governments accountable. She mentioned Safety Pin, for example, which is looking at new technologies. I completely agree. I think that the new technology, just technologies in general, will hopefully add a different level to this that we haven't seen in the past. That's still to be explored. Another question issue I wanted to look at that came up, and it was asked by a few people on Twitter and then also in the discussion, was, do women make better leaders? Do we want women in leadership positions because they're going to run the city better, they're going to be less corrupt? And I don't know if you have response to this, but I know one thing that I first thought of was, well, maybe, but it's also just about equal representation and having a government that represents the people and isn't just representing half of the population.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. When I saw that question come up on within the online discussion, I thought it was it's such a broad question. I mean, I think the magnitude of the challenge is into both developed and developing city contexts. And I think it's it brings together the issue of representation, but it also brings together accountability in parallel. And I think, and one of the points that I raised, or one of the comments that I made, and I feel I should say in the online discussion, the questions were great, but I feel like I couldn't answer any that I could just answer with more questions, which I guess is kind of the nature of this kind of a discussion. There's no real solution, so to speak. So it just raises more and more questions. But for me, a point that I think is often overlooked in the conversation about having adequate representation, particularly at a local governance level, is that we tend not to our male leaders is on equality. I mean, it's sometimes I feel that if it's a case of that we're not achieving equal representation, that any lever, whereas I feel that we can still hold our leaders to account on what are they doing to ensure better gender equality, what's in their agenda, what have they achieved in the past, what is their position on it, and make that conversation a little bit more live between civil society and leadership, if only to advance the narrative in the short term. I mean, we have such a long way to go before getting even close to achieving equal representation. The challenge is so huge. But I feel that ensuring that the leaders that are decision-making position are likely to are challenged on their position on issues that are more mainstream in the feminist narrative is a logical place to make a change.
Great, thank you. Catherine, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
I'm not sure that it's directly linked, but I was just thinking about how the other thing that has to change, on our path to equal representation, is how significant it is to have strong women leaders that we can visibly see and connect with in that position, and how important that is for young women to have role models that they can look up to who are in those leadership positions, that let those girls know that that can be me one day, right? And I think part of another thing that's kind of connected to this is I was just remembering that I read an article recently, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it was about this whole American election of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, and what does that look like? And one of the things that the article talked about was about how the different leadership styles of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are directly related to kind of how we envision kind of like our stereotypes, I guess, in particular gender stereotypes, right? And so when we think of leader, it often is someone who seems strong and motivated and taking this big stance and maybe waving his hands a lot, in the way that we see Donald Trump. And in this article, they had done all of this research with different people who were working on both campaigns, and everyone in Hillary's campaign said that the reason why they like working with her and continue to work with her is because she listens, and she actually really listens, which is more of a trait that we would stereotypically kind of assign to a woman. And so the way that we have leadership and the way that we view and perceive what makes a good leader and what makes a strong leader and what makes us believe and have faith in those leaders, I think is also something that we need to look at from a gender lens and perhaps break down and give alternate models of leadership embodied not only in the physical representation of people, but also in leadership styles.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Just the idea of meeting women in positions of leadership as role models. Everyone loves to quote the study that was undertaken in India at the local council level of how when they actually put in quotas for women in the local council level and seeing those women in these positions of power actually increased girls' education rates, and all of a sudden their families are starting to say, oh, also, you know, education is also important for my daughter because look at what she could become one day. And I think that's one of the most powerful studies that we have that shows, one, why measures such as quotas are necessary, but also how just that idea of seeing someone in a position of power can change so much. Great. Okay. Well, if we want to keep moving along, our next question is one on data, which I know is always a hard question because, one, how do we measure these things? And unfortunately, there is a lack of data, so it's kind of coming up with new tools. But I wonder if you guys have any tools that you could share with us. I also wanted to put something out there that was brought up in the online discussion to sort of frame this this question as we answer it. And it's the idea that the data on women's lived realities needs to have two parts. So one needs to look at access, and then it also needs to look at control. So access to sort of infrastructure resources, the opportunities that are available in urban settings, and then control over these things. So I don't know if you have any examples you can share, but sort of thinking of those two aspects of when we're gathering data, how do we measure the access and the control?
I can just make a quick comment on that. I mean, the project that I'm most familiar with, and I know it's often used as an example, is the Safety Pin project, of course, because it's so data driven, and it's I think it's a good example of you know, very comprehensive and simply powerful data. But my experience with that project, a lot of other realities for me around what the issues are, and I found that there tends, I think at a city level in particularly, there's a lot of actors already engaged in data generation processes. I mean, there's data generation being undertaken at the city level, at state level, by various NGOs and civil society groups, by academics. There's diverse and very rich data pool there, but something that I feel often is that it's you know, systematically it's weak in being able to I mean, it's great to have a network of data generators bringing in different perspectives from different angles, but to have something of a clearinghouse in terms of quality and validity of that data and a system of response, or at least guidelines for response that link that data and that conversation to policy is something which is weak. And I think it was Caroline that made the comment on the online discussion about the diversity of data being a strength, and I very much agree with that. And I think, you know, we need to kind of push also for more creative ways to ensure that we have a very people-centered approach to the importance of data in really representing what the reality is on the ground, and also to kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what are the emerging issues. You know, these issues kind of mutate and evolve also. But I've never really come across, and maybe you guys have an example of something of a kind of a collaboration or a partnership or a network where data is set to particular guidelines or standards and packaged in a way that it, you know, that it packs a particular punch, supported also by a strong link to the policy narrative. It's always an issue that I kind of have at the back of my mind when this data conversation arises. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that.
I think that's a really key issue, especially in terms of, you know, we're talking about big data now, right? And so who owns control, accesses that data and stuff, and it's a big challenge. I was in June, I was at a New Cities Summit. It's called the New Cities Summit here in it was in Montreal this year, and the focus was on technology to help solve urban problems, right, and urban challenges. And so what does that look like? And so obviously this question of data came up quite often throughout the conference, and it was interesting for me. One of the challenges that came with it was that in the bureaucracy of government, right, the the controls that are in place for how to collect, manage, and who owns the data, and how do we deal with that, and what's publicly available or not, and how do we respect privacy within all of that, is it takes so long to make change in government that you just kind of can't even use that data yet, right? And so we're seeing new partnerships that are being formed with research institutions who are then able to work with whoever develops the apps and owns the apps, and that's where the big data goes. And then it's the research institutions that work with the government, but they're the ones who are physically housing the data, well, as much as that data is physical, I guess, you know, housing the data and analyzing the data, and then working with governments to understand that data and what to do with it. And so we're kind of having to skirt around more traditional forms of data collection. And it just seems like all of this is evolving so quickly as well that we're having to improvise solutions in a sense, because if government then can't take that data and doesn't know what to do with it, I mean, it's a challenge in and of itself, right, that needs to be resolved in this. And I think just to go back to the introduction of this, I think we talked about access and control of city services and how do we have data to support that, but I think the quality is really the key factor, because it's one thing, and that's where the qualitative research also kind of comes in as an essential piece to things, because it's one thing to be able to look at the numbers, but to understand what that means in the daily lives of the people who are in the city and who are depending on these city spaces and the city services, it's a completely different portrait that we begin to understand, right? And so I think that that kind of complementary data sets, and we were talking about that earlier on the discussion as well, those complementary data sets are really essential for having a clear picture. So the big data is one thing, but then understanding what that looks like in the daily lives of people from multiple perspectives, I think is really what's key. I think one way that we have seen that's been interesting and kind of a good way of shedding light on some of these things has been gender budgeting. I actually feel like that's been one tool that has been used in really kind of interesting ways to shed light on gender gaps in kind of strong data-driven, concrete ways. That's been really eye-opening for governments.
Great, thank you. Do you actually have any examples of governments who have used the gender budgeting?
I feel like Atlanta uses it a lot, which is, I feel like there's I'm gonna blank on her name now, but there's a really strong woman who's in government in Atlanta who talks a lot about it, and they've done training for other municipal governments, and they've kind of come around and they've been really kind of championing it, which is maybe an unlikely city for it, but really seems to be strong on that front. Hillary might have some examples.
I was afraid you were going to say that. From the financing perspective, you know, I really don't. I'm sure if Juma was on this call, he would probably be able to relate to some examples from the top of my head. I don't, but I really like the comment that you made, and it just a few other points for me. And I think, you know, it's interesting because how we traditionally have measured related issues. You know, there's a lot of ongoing practice there. There's lessons learned. It's a very live conversation. But governance, on the other hand, is like kind of a slippery topic. You know, it's solid indicators about what are good what constitutes good governance. I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric around governance when it's in practice, or what may be some elements of good governance, or what are kind of the cornerstones of good governance. But it is cautious not to just build it on kind of a Western interpretation of governance is delicate, and it results in the conversation being very, you know, normative and a little bit distant from practice sometimes, I think. But something that comes up a lot, at least in the Safer Cities program, is one of being able to measure the kind of the shift in values and perceptions and norms and behaviors. And it's something that that Jim and I have had a lot of conversations about as well, because, you know, in trying to embed practices of monitoring and measuring, it's a difficult one to capture. There's really not kind of, at least that I have come across, there's not really a solid practice there to fall back on. And it's really important for this conversation, I think, both sides, on the governance side and within the city as a public entity. It's important both for a system of government that is ripe to kind of take on these issues and understand them, and also civil society to be able to push effectively and hold. That value shift is a very important aspect to measure. And it kind of, I don't know, it kind of falls off the table, I think, a lot in this conversation. Maybe it's because it's just a little bit difficult to pin down, or maybe because there's, nobody has yet. But I think it's important, as it goes on. It's something that it hasn't really been addressed directly, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Kind of underline everything that we've been talking about, because we can cities can provide the sort of infrastructure, the basic services, but if the social norms aren't there that allow women to have equal access to them, if the social norms say that, oh no, girls shouldn't, be using these services in the same way as men, shouldn't have equal access, I mean, that's right then they're gonna sort of be blocked from enjoying that in the same way. And at the same time, at the OECD Development Center, we have something called the Social Institutions and Gender Index, where we actually kind of look at these social norms. We look at the national level, and we have been interested in looking at the subnational level and also at the city level, but it is something that we've found is very hard to get sort of in one data. How do you measure that? How do you conceptualize that? And then how do you get enough that it's meaningful? So
right.
That's a really important point. Great. Well, that's kind of our last question that we had going over. I don't know if you guys wanted to give closing remarks, if you had any sort of final thoughts. And then I was going to ask Catherine to sort of fill us in some on what her upcoming program at Habitat 3 looks like for gender. So Hillary, I don't know if you'd like to...
Yeah. A few closing remarks. Yeah, so I'm really sorry to have missed the first part of that, and I'm sure it was really interesting. One thing, this whole participating in this conversation, because I think this is such a big issue right now, and the whole, not just between well, I think the topic of gender and governments raises particular issues, but the whole issue of urban governance is really, evolving fast, and it's demanding a lot of attention, both from development and humanitarian spheres. And it's really nice to kind of be part of this conversation. But one thing that was kind of throughout the course, and from looking at other people's comments as well, I think that there's a tendency to apply what are, kind of applied to state level government issues to sort of the same to cities, which has a number of challenges to it. I mean, first of all, the state level conversation of governance is also very contentious. There's a lot of criticism about state building practices and norms, and translating that to a city context is maybe not particularly appropriate, and not so to how city governance differs. And I see that kind of happening in the background, and I'm and trying to push the urban issue forward as being slightly different and being specific is a constant challenge. And for that reason, I think that this conversation is, it's going to go on and get more complex and become increasingly interesting over time. So it would be great to keep this going, I guess, in some way. But let's see.
Great, thank you. Catherine?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's only going to get more kind of interesting and complex, as you say, as we move on. But I think that there couldn't be a better time for it. Now that we have, you know, these SDGs on urban and SDG on gender, and increasing conversation about how all of the SDGs, in particular, you know, these ones, intersect with one another. And so I think we're starting to look at things in a much broader, more connected way. Something that probably should have been done a long time ago, right? And so I think that we've kind of nailed down some good normative, right? I think the key challenge now is, what does that mean on the ground, and how are we going to implement this? How are we going to monitor this? And how are we going to make sure that women continue to have an active role throughout all phases of urban development and governance, right? So from decision making to conceptualization of issues and problems and solutions, and in implementing them and in monitoring them. And so I think that we're kind of going forward now to Quito next week with these things in mind. And so just as a kind of a quick recall, you know, is that this is our third, and I think it was time, I think it was is the right order for things, you know. So these online discussions began with looking at mobility issues for women in Africa in particular. Then we kind of broadened things and looked at safety issues for women in cities around the world, in both the developed and developing world. And now we're looking at governance again across the globe in cities. What does that look like for women, and what could it look like for women, and what are some of the things that we need to have it in place in order to enable that to happen effectively. And so each of these discussions has been really rich. And, you know, as Hillary mentioned, and I had said the same thing to Annalise offline actually before we began this conversation. I said, you know, I don't know that we're going to have answers for all of these questions that we want to look at today. You know, in fact, yes, they generate a lot more questions, you know, and perhaps we have some anecdotes here and there, but we don't have concrete answers, you know, and in each city context is also so unique and dynamic that having a single solution doesn't necessarily work either, right? And so we need to have this kind of creative look at things, and how can we adapt and evolve with things. And so with that in mind, the Habitat 3 meetings begin next week. In fact, on the 15th, so next Saturday, is the Women's Assembly, which will run all day. And that's part of the official programming for the Habitat 3 conference. And these are exactly the kinds of issues that we're going to be looking at during that Women's Assembly. And so we're going to be talking about issues of safe cities. We're going to be talking about issues of governance. We're going to be talking about women in political participation. And so it'll really capture a lot of what we've spoken about here. And so obviously I'll take the kind of questions and outcomes and recommendations that we have from these discussions forward, again, as things that we can discuss in our collective, about, especially about things like implementation, right? And so we have a series of kind of breakouts that we're going to be discussing things more practically with the group of participants, where we're going to look at practices, because we're not starting from scratch. There have been things that have been done. We're going to look at policies. So what strong policies look like, how can policies be strengthened, what are policy gaps? We're going to be looking around partnerships. So what kind of partnerships need to be in place to support effective implementation, and what are commitments, but also our non-negotiables moving forward, right? So talking about data, like disaggregated data, minimally by sex and by age, minimally, right, is something that we can probably get behind, you know, as a non-negotiable way forward. And so those are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in the Women's Assembly. That's I'm going to culminate in kind of a series of commitments and recommendations that we're going to carry forward throughout the week. There are so many events throughout the week as well, that the advantage of having something like the Women's Assembly at the beginning means that we can have a stronger collective voice as we move forward throughout the rest of the agenda, right? And so the messages that we kind of take away with us from those discussions are things that we can bring up in other sessions throughout the week, to make sure that we're not just speaking to people who are interested in women's issues, but speaking with people who perhaps didn't attend the Women's Assembly or hadn't even connected to the fact that there was a gender dimension to cities, right? And so we can try and work throughout the week also to raise awareness about these issues, to kind of begin those discussions at a much more kind of broad level as well.
Wow, it's going to be interesting to see or to hear back from you, and in particular about how things went once the dust settles. It would be great to know.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a very exciting overview. It'll be really interesting to hear everything that takes place and everything that comes out, and especially after having these 3 online discussions, I'm very excited to see what's going to take place. So thank you very much, both of you, for participating. Also, thanks to all the experts who participate, not just in this discussion, but also in the past 2 discussions. For anyone who's watching, they can feel free to check out this online discussion on Wikigender, and then also the other 2 online discussions, so on women in urban mobility and on the gender dynamics of Africa's urban transformation. So thank you very much, and see you soon on Wikigender.